Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. In the past few years, a new set of terms have emerged as buzzwords in conversations about racial justice. Terms like woke, CRT or critical race theory, and DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion. Listening to one group use these terms, you may think any of them refers to something that can be ignored at best or is dangerous to society at worst. Listening to another group, you may hear that the first group has no idea what they're talking about and that society can only move forward with CRT and DEI. In both cases, conversations are shut down without a chance for deeper knowledge and understanding of why each side feels so strongly about their position, or in some cases, what the terms even mean. Today we're going to turn our attention to one of these terms, CRT, to try and better understand what it is and what Christians have to learn. We're joined by a guest who has spent a great deal of time thinking about and studying CRT as a Christian. Dr. Ed Uszynski is an author, speaker, sports minister, racial literacy consultant, and marriage conference speaker. Along with 2 theological degrees from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, Ed has a PhD in American Culture Studies from Bowling Green State University, a program which dealt heavily with critical theory. Using the background of his doctoral work, a heart for reconciliation and justice, and an ability to blend biblical wisdom with practical living in the midst of complex cultural realities, Ed wrote a book that serves as the starting point for our conversation today, Untangling Critical Race Theory: What Christians Need to Know and Why It Matters. Along with covering an overview of what critical race theory is and where it came from, our discussion ranges from working through the questions CRT tries to answer and the insight Christians can glean from those questions, why race seems to be such a difficult topic to address in evangelical churches, and how our ability to face these topics affects our ability to love our neighbors. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Dr. Ed Uszynski. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Ed, thank you for joining me today.
Good to be here, Eric. Been looking forward to this conversation with you.
So I've been curious. You came to studying critical race theory and critical theory sort of long before it was in the public consciousness. What was your path to choosing that as a field of study?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's really 2 parts to it. So in terms of choosing it as a field of study, I'd say I actually really didn't choose it. I didn't realize that when I went to do my PhD in 2008, that a significant amount of our reading, my PhD was in American Culture Studies. And honestly, I thought that was going to be going in a different direction than what it went. The direction it went was to read tons of critical theory and tons of Marxist-inspired and Marxist-backed literature. I mean, I was in a public school, and that's just kind of what made up the readings in that program. And so it was the whole reason why I even did it in the first place, though, was really to study secular culture. I'd already done 2 theological degrees at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School a decade earlier, and I really wanted to do my PhD at a secular school in a secular topic. And there's a bunch of reasons behind that, but I did that on purpose, but just didn't realize that so much of my reading was going to be in critical theory and critical race theory. Now, the other lane is that in the 1990s, in my ministry, the sport ministry that I'm a part of, we were having all kinds of conversations with athletes about race and using critical race theory topics like privilege, like systemic racism, like helping people even map out their own racial history. You know, those are critical race theory inspired ideas, and we were using that in our discipleship and in our processing times with student athletes on campus, and when we would have them at a retreat, and it was always really productive and gospel centered. And again, at the time, I critical race theory didn't have the boogeyman connotations that it's taken on in the last 5 or 6 years nationally. It was just a mode of questioning, and which is really what critical race theory is, anyways. It's raising questions about how racial power works and what the consequences are of having lived in a hyper racialized society for centuries. So now I don't want to get ahead of us, but that's kind of how I came into it. We were doing it in ministry, and then I stumbled into it in my PhD program.
Yeah, which I think is interesting because when I see American culture studies, that's not what comes to my mind either. But then reading through some of your book, it does seem like culture studies in academia kind of refers to that. So
Yeah,
is that
I mean
true?
that's a whole nother conversation, but you know, there's a bunch of different ways to study history. There's a conservative path, a more traditionalist, a more federalist path, and there's a more progressive path that is trying to um, not just study history as it's been given to us, but the power structures behind how history gets called history in the first place. And a history from below, so to speak, is a more progressive, you know, among the people versus the power holders in society. So again, that's all ends up being a whole nother discussion. But in most secular history programs, you're going to study more from the progressive side of things.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious. So my background is that I studied also in uh Christian-based schools, Bethel
Okay.
University and Denver Seminary, and studied race justice in both of those venues, and then kind of went out into the world, ended up working at a camp for a while, and then came back like into broader society, it kind of felt like. And
Okay.
suddenly people were talking about CRT. And I was like, what is CRT? So it struck me coming into it that I spent so much time thinking about race and didn't encounter that at all. How do you have a sense of how CRT came sort of into public consciousness and kind of became that boogeyman that you mentioned that it has become?
Well, I mean, there's definitely a bunch of different things that happened culturally that made us all start talking about race, but the the incident that or the person that I kind of credit for popularizing it or getting it out in the media is Christopher Rufo, who I haven't really even heard his name much lately, but 5 6 years ago he was how what's the word? He was a conservative lobbyist in Washington who realized as he was hearing from different people around the country who felt like they were being forced into um, race seminars at work, and before DEI was even a thing, where they felt like they were being discriminated against as white people. And as Rufo looked into the training materials that were being used in some of these seminars, he saw in the notes that there were this language of critical race theory, or somebody would label themselves as a critical race theorist. And so that's how he kind of stumbled across it, because really as an academic discipline, it started in the 1980s. So it was like 40 years ago. It's been around for decades, within mostly within legal studies. But within racial studies more broadly, it's been around and talked about for 40 years. And again, it's an approach. It's a counter narrative to the prevailing narrative from the 60s and 70s, which said we're because we passed civil rights laws, we're post-racial now. They weren't using that language, but it's really what people meant. We're beyond race. Race isn't a problem for us in this country anymore. We've made it illegal for, people to separate out white versus black drinking fountains. You're no longer allowed to discriminate overtly in hotels or restaurants. Okay, so laws got passed and we're good now. And yet discrimination persisted and inequality persisted. And there were these effects of, again, having laws passed across centuries that continued to maintain discrimination and inequality in spite of the fact that new laws had been passed to say you can't discriminate anymore. So critical race theorists were just saying, we're gonna produce a counter narrative. You say race isn't an issue anymore. We're gonna flip that around and say race is always an issue, and let's ask questions about how race is affecting this moment. You're saying that law is always objective and Lady Justice always is equal and fair, and we're gonna say you should always be suspicious of that. That power is always at work in the courtroom. And there's always a million things going on that are not objective. And when race gets involved, as one person said, it always helps to be white. It never hurts to be white, and it never helps to be black. Like I heard one lawyer say that one time. And so critical race theorists, again, we're just kind of spinning the prevailing narrative on its head, the prevailing narrative about race, which is that we're all good now. And they're saying, no, we're not. And here's why not. So that's what they were doing, and that's still really what they're trying to do today.
Yeah. And to me, that seems like, from what I have gone through with academic study, that all seems viable, maybe, to say the least. Like it it would be wrong in my mind to say that race does not play any factor in the way that each of those things that you just talked about exists in the world.
Well,
So go ahead.
yeah, well, Eric, and I forgot, you asked, how did it come to be kind of become popularized, or how did it come out into the public? And the reaction to critical race theorists in the late 80s was the same as it is now. The more conservative approach to race prevails, and that is very individualistic. You get to make choices. It's your choices that wind up determining whether or not you move up the ladder or not. It's not because there's systemic race or problems, or because there's some kind of systemic evil that's holding you back. And that's always been a more conservative view of things. And so that same mentality is here today. So when Rufo and others got wind, when Donald Trump got wind of, this kind of critical race theory type, more progressive approach to thinking about race, they punched back and said, yeah, we're not going to have that. We're not going to talk about systemic race issues. We're not going to talk about a version of history that paints white people or our ancestors as having been evil or complicit in something evil. Like, again, that's kind of what's always been part of the problem when it comes to history, is that we don't actually want to talk about the evil that existed among our ancestors. We know how to celebrate the good things that they did, but we don't know how to look that evil in the face. So that was true in the 1980s, and it's true in 2025. Still is.
Yeah. It struck me while I was reading your book too that there's it seems like there are multiple sort of conservative streams. Like I think in our context, we think about conservative Christians, conservative evangelicals, and there are probably a lot of people who think about that too. But there's also a conservative secular uh, presence, I guess, in the world. Is there a difference in the way that sort of a conservative secular response looks compared to what you've seen from conservative Christians to this in particular?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it looks different all over the country. Um, but it's getting harder and harder, I think, to separate out what the difference between what it means to be a conservative Christian versus what it means to be a conservative, being conservative politically, which is also, I think, a big problem, that those two ideas are so wed together, that there's almost an idolatry for conservative politics that muddies our ability to think like Christians. In other words, we're affected way more by our politicians than we are our prophets. And that's a problem for us as Christians. So, so I don't have a problem with individualism in the sense that I feel like, yes, people will ultimately be accountable individually to God. But the Bible, which is a very Republican idea, it's a very conservative political idea. I don't have any problem with that. But the Bible also talks continuously about watching out for marginalized and vulnerable populations. In fact, like the whole Testament is God condemning the Israelites for turning their back on him and pursuing other gods, and for not watching out for the vulnerable in their midst. It's all over the place. So like he's saying, don't come and try to worship me if you're allowing evils, if social injustice to happen towards vulnerable people in your community. Well, that's a pretty democratic and progressive sounding idea politically today. And so it's a real problem when, and I've had this happen where my Christian friends and people that are in ministry with me, they hear that we're supposed to watch out for vulnerable populations and they right away resist that, or they kind of stiff arm that idea because that sounds like democratic politics, or it sounds like progressives. And it's like, well, it may, but it also sounds like Jesus. It also sounds like the prophets. It sounds like the Bible. So again, if you don't realize that, again, you probably have been more influenced by Fox News than you have been by Malachi or Amos,
Yeah.
you know?
So, so do you feel like there is a biblical literacy issue at play here then? And is there more than that going on?
Another good question. I definitely think there's a biblical literacy issue. I don't know. And it's, again, it's been true across 30 years of my ministry. I just feel like we as a people read less and less, period, let alone our Bibles. Now, again, a lot of people will listen to their Bible, but I just feel like it's gone down, slowly down. Even Christians' knowledge of the Bible from cover to cover, and just having a holistic understanding of redemption history and what God has been doing, what He's revealed about Himself from Genesis to Revelation, in terms of not only His interaction with human beings, but what He expects of us while we're here on this planet and until He returns. I think there's a lack of literacy there, but I would also say that, and I talk about this in the book, and I'm not the only one that's brought this up. People are also taught to read the Bible in a certain way. They've gone through seminaries and been taught. You went to Bible school. Our Bible schools have taught us to read the Bible in a certain way, which again often ends up just meaning that we emphasize certain themes to the exclusion of others. And if I can just cut to the chase, the whole idea of justice in general has tended to be neglected, at least in the circles that I've ran in my 30 plus years being involved with a parachurch organization, my attending, what at one time was one of the top evangelical seminaries in the country. Justice as a theme was not necessarily emphasized. Okay, as an example. And so if you're thin on your thinking about justice, if anytime justice gets talked about, it's in the context of liberation theology or progressive theologies, which again are kind of viewed negatively or as heretical theologies, and you don't ever actually ask, what does the Bible actually then teach about justice? So these theologies may have distorted that idea in some way or taken it in a direction whose conclusions we can't support, or they've left out sin. But then what does the Bible actually teach about justice? Because it's a massive theme in the scriptures. So how is it that we don't get taught on that? I was just on a podcast yesterday, actually, about something completely different. And the guy that I was talking to said, in the church, and he's a pastor in the church down in Texas. He said, it's so strange that the biggest idols in our culture today tend to be things that we don't teach about from the pulpit. Money, sex, sports, race, I think is another just humongous topic that just doesn't get talked about from the pulpit. Again, if there's some huge thing that happens in society, maybe it forces us as pastors or ministers to talk about it in the pulpit or in a Bible study. But most of the time we tend to avoid teaching on those huge idols in our culture. And I think that's a problem. I think it leaves us as a people illiterate or just not able to think well from a biblical perspective about these kinds of topics.
Yeah. And I could probably come up with any number of reasons why I think that's the case. Do you have any ideas about why we don't talk about things like that? Does it go to people in the pulpit not knowing how to address it? Does it go to it's easier to talk about other things? Is it a
Well,
combination of that and more?
yeah, I was going to say, what do you think are some of the reasons?
I think that's the curious thing to me is that I think in some cases, folks in the pulpit don't know how to talk about these things. I think that's, you could probably go into any number of churches and see that. I also feel like there are a lot of places where people who are in the pulpit are more keyed in on that being a thing that needs to be discussed, and maybe their congregations are not in the same place as them. I've been
Okay.
in I've been in churches where I would say it's a like quote unquote standard white evangelical conservative Christian church and heard things the pastor's been saying like that's actually really I don't know if people in here are picking up on how the one that's coming to mind, my parents were going to a church at one point in northern Minnesota, and the pastor had just done the Camino in Spain on his sabbatical and came
Okay.
back and was preaching through Isaiah, kind of talking, like relating things that he had experienced on the Camino to things that were coming up in Isaiah. And I was like, there is a lot of justice themed things in here that I don't know how people in the congregation are going to react to because I was not a part of the congregation, so I didn't know. But I
Yeah.
think those are two things, and so I think on my end, that's why I'm trying to have conversations like this on the podcast to kind of help people think about that. But I'm also curious to know when I meet people from other places what they're seeing around them.
Yeah. Good, Eric. So I would say, or the word that was going through my mind as you were saying that is fear.
Yeah.
I'm afraid. So some of it may just be my own ignorance as a teacher, which again, I don't say that in a condemning way. It's like most of us have not been taught well. Again, even if we're just going to focus on race and we're white, most of us come to that topic at a bit of a deficit. It's just we haven't been taught. It's not been part of our conversation in seminary or undergrad or in our families. And when it was derogatory. It was something negative. So there's ignorance, there's fear because those topics are divisive and people get hysterical about them. And why would I talk about something that's gonna like immediately divide my church or it's going to give my church opportunity to kind of lose their minds? And we again, our answer to that might be well, because that's your role as a pastor. Like you
Right.
should at sometimes play the role of prophet, but again, we're asking why it is that we might not do that. And so we're afraid of what the response is going to be from our congregation and responses that we've seen around the country, even when guys have tried to do that. And then the thing also that I put on the table, Eric, is that it's a demonic stronghold. And so, I don't even know exactly what that means, but it is a demonic stronghold and has been across centuries. And so he somehow we're blinded to it. it's like we're unable to, I don't want to say unable. It's extremely difficult. It's extremely challenging to get past the stronghold in people's hearts and minds and to bring healing and to face our own demons, to face our own sin. Like people they don't want to. I don't want to have to face that. So I don't like being confronted with sin in my life or dark areas of my heart that need to be, extracted from my insides and sanctified. That's painful and uncomfortable. So there's a lot of other topics to talk about. Why would I purposely go after ones that are going to create pain, that are a place where Satan's hanging out, that are going to potentially divide my church, and that frankly, I don't really know what I'm talking about? I don't have a ton of confidence. I mean, that was quite a list we just made for why we don't do it.
Yeah. I do wonder though with that, it feels like there are some places where evangelical Christians actually do like feeling convicted about different things. And it seems like, I mean, there is some line that I don't know where it is where people get uncomfortable feeling that way to the point of not wanting to go there. But something that struck me, Latasha Morrison, who you just did a thing at Exiles with her.
Yeah.
I don't think it was there. I think it was a different event, but I heard her talk about how uh, people who are in the theological stream that uh, a Calvinist stream, I guess, that holds to the total depravity kind of across the board, are a lot of times the people who are most against the idea that race is a place where we can have these sorts of issues. Like that's a thing that's done now, and it seems like it doesn't make sense with if your theology says we have total depravity across all of our experience as humans. So I don't know that I have a question going into that. It's just an observation
Well,
at this point.
it doesn't make sense except for the fact that I may be more committed to white supremacy, which again, that's a phrase that just really rankles people. But when I say white supremacy, I don't necessarily mean clan, but I mean white normativity. White norms are superior. And my way of thinking as a white person gets to stay at the top of the hierarchy. Again, that's such a those are distasteful sentences. But the reality is, anytime that's been threatened, anytime that gets threatened in history, there's significant pushback to that. Um, and that's world history. That as white Europeans have gone out to colonize other almost always non-white populations, they are setting up a hierarchy that says our norms and our way of being is going to stay at the top. And when there's pushback or when there's what we've called rebellion, or where there's an abolitionist mindset to try to set people free or to try to bring equality, to try to dissolve the hierarchy, the powers that be are always going to push back on that.
Yeah.
Even in the church. And again, that's just like bizarre to have to say that, but even in the church, which is why sometimes we as white people need to be willing to admit that we actually are committed to a white superiority. We maybe have never thought about it consciously, but if you start to, extract what's going on inside of our hearts and minds and what our values are and what we believe about others as compared to ourselves, you start to see, yeah, that actually is inside of me pretty significantly, that I think white is right, that white is best, that the way we do things is the superior way. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's a
And
problem. Yeah, that's a problem in the church.
and if you're trained to say race does not matter anymore, it's not a category that we need to pay attention to, that like you don't have a category to be able to hold that as a possibility.
That's right. That's right. And that just becomes a convenient way to keep things the way they are. You know, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? And the way they are is I get to stay on top of the hierarchy. So there's always going to be people who are not on the top of the hierarchy who are not okay with that.
Yeah.
And they're going
It's
to push, yeah, they're going to push back on that.
yeah. That's making me think of the one quote that I wrote down from the book. So you said, when I raise these concerns, so critical theory commentary on capitalism in particular with Christian friends, too often I'm met with a defensive, what system would you rather have then? But instead, what if we started asking, what responsibility do I have to address the problems the current system creates for people not living in my house?
Mm.
Is there one of my issues when people talk about capitalism being the best system is that it seems like that's a conversation stopping point rather than a, is there any sort of way we could make the system better, or is there any other system that might work better than anything that currently exists in the world? Is it is it just to the point, is it truly just to the point that people for whom the system is working don't want the system to change despite whatever religious beliefs they hold? Is that where we are right now?
I think that's where we've always been. I just had this conversation the other day with somebody too, Eric. So let's talk about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is sort of a stereotypical, wildly successful capitalist. Okay. And again, I'm not saying that I don't. So if you're listening, hear that as a neutral statement. He is a wildly successful capitalist. He's sort of like the prototype. Okay. And he's knocking down walls. He's the art of the deal. You know, he's making deals all over the world right now. Everybody says he's playing chess when others are playing checkers. And I don't know whether he is or isn't, but my guess is he is. He's a businessman. And when it comes to money, he seems to know what he's doing to make sure he gets more of it and the people around him get more of it, even if it's at the expense of other nations, other businesses, other whatevers. Okay. That's what capitalism is at its core. It's the pursuit of getting more. I'm going to pursue my best interests, and if everybody's doing that, we say, you know, it raises the tide for everybody. Okay, if everybody's kind of pursuing their best interests. Okay, but what always happens in the midst of that is there will be people that lose. There will be people that when you try to clean up not having illegal aliens in our country and of criminal elements, okay, if that's the card that you're going to play, you're also going to wind up disrupting lots of non-criminal people who actually are trying to be here legally, and our system makes it extremely difficult for them to do that. Okay, so let's just say that. So as a Christian, I should be able to just acknowledge what this capitalist impulse does, and whether you like it or don't like it, be able to acknowledge what it does and recognize that as a Christian, my responsibility is actually to pay attention to those people, again, the vulnerable populations, the people that get trampled, the people that have injustice done to them, that they're viewed as just sort of what do you call it? It's sort of like the cost of war. They're casualties that just come with decisions like this being made. Okay, well, I don't blame Donald Trump and Donald Trump type people for doing what they do. He's being true to himself. And there are consequences and casualties in being true to that system that I, as a Christian, have responsibility for.
Yeah.
Okay. And I just feel like that kind of talk, instead of getting wrapped up even in arguing about whether capitalism is better or socialism is better, or Marxism, all the evils, like, I don't even need to worry about that. I'm 57 years old. I'm not going to change world economic systems, but I, as a Christian in my sphere of influence, are supposed to be paying attention to people that get taken advantage of because of those systems. That's kind of built into the gospel. It's built into my charter as a Christ follower, is to pay attention to the least of these. It's to pay attention to the prisoner, to the widow, to the orphan. I mean, just think about what those categories represent. They represent people that don't have power, people that wind up being casualties of whatever processes are being put in place, I should be concerned about them. So does your church do that? Like, I think that's a really good question to ask. Not do we have a missions program, not do we have some group of people that's giving money to underprivileged, but literally is that woven into how we think and what we talk about and how we view the scriptures? Like, are we regularly being provoked to care for the Somalian population that's in Minnesota? Okay. Most of what I hear when they get talked about is not caring language. Let's just say that I was just up in Minnesota actually last week and was in conversations about with some of the social problems that are up there. I don't think I've ever actually heard Christian people talk positively about what is our role and responsibility for this group of people in our midst. It's always about what a problem they are. Okay. Again, I can see how they are a problem to your norms and to your way of life and your way of being. I get that. But here they are. And so what does it mean to be Christian among them?
Yeah.
That's going to end the podcast, isn't it? People are turning it off right now. They got too close to home.
That's all right. I think the people who want to stay, welcome, continue listening through the end of the conversation and to many more to come.
Oh, well, we're laughing about it, but really, Eric, that is really what it comes
Yeah.
down to. And those are hard questions and they're uncomfortable questions and they're self-sacrificing and dying to myself questions. Like, I don't like having to be faced with that, but that's what it means to pick up your cross daily and follow me.
Yeah.
It's to learn how to love people that are unlovable or that nobody else is loving. That's the countercultural Christian way of living. That very group of people that's getting written about, talked about, ostracized. What does it mean for me to move towards them? Just like Jesus moved towards the woman at the well and just countless others, you know?
Yeah.
So
So do you have examples of people you've seen who are doing this well, sort of addressing these things well, and
it's
sort of what takeaways we could take from those examples?
It's interesting because I always hesitate to put names out. I mean, for all the reasons that can be a bad idea. But I will say this: I've been particularly taken with Pastor David Swanson. For example, he wrote a book 5, 6 years ago called "Rediscipling the White Church." He's a pastor on, I believe, the west side of Chicago, and he's in a multicultural environment as a white man and I think very conservative in his theology. And yet he's asking the hard questions about what does it mean to embody Christ in the midst of the city? What does it mean to be the hands and feet of Jesus in the midst of vulnerable populations and populations that are exposed to injustice more than others? And I've seen him even on social media writing things that I think would make a lot of my conservative friends really uncomfortable because he's standing with the immigrants right now in the greater Chicago area. And he's not getting caught up in whether, what their status is legally as citizens. He's getting caught up in what it means to make sure injustice is not being done to them. He's trying to stand up with black and brown brothers and sisters to make sure that they don't wind up feeling betrayed by white evangelicals in the moment where they most need white evangelicals to stand with them, which again, that's been one of the themes throughout the decades is that white folks will, again, when there's an uprising, when George Floyd is murdered in Minneapolis and everybody's talking about it, we'll gather the troops. We'll have a conference. We'll have that as a topic at our conference. We'll maybe do a sermon or two about racial justice or sin in the world. And then once that dies down, we fade away and we stop standing with those brothers and sisters. Or here, I'll give you another one. We'll talk racial reconciliation. We'll talk diversity and inclusivity and, all those kind of catch terms and catch phrases inside of our organization. But when a wealthy donor, usually a wealthy white donor, says, I'm really uncomfortable with some of that talk, that sounds like CRT. Are you guys going woke? We will too often make whatever adjustment needs to be made to make sure that he or she is placated, to make sure that he or she is comforted. And we will abandon or turn away from this, whatever this topic is that we thought was righteous. And that's why we were standing for it. But because they threatened us to leave or they threatened to take their money away, we're going to turn our back on them. That happens all the time. There was a book called The Religion of Whiteness that just came out by Glenn Bracey and I believe Michael Emerson, the same guy that wrote Divided by Faith 25 years ago. And again, they're just doing sociological research-based studies on like how do you qualify what it means to think like a white person within evangelicalism and what the difference is between them and the rest of, again, non-white populations in America. It's actually a pretty fascinating book. But the whole beginning of the book are just testimonies of Black and brown men and women who feel betrayed, consistently betrayed. And it's even worse when it's white brothers and sisters that have stood for a period of time, when there's organizations like a Transform Minnesota or an organization like Crew, like mine, that will stand and speak and kind of get aligned. But then when the heat gets turned up, and I'm not saying this about Transform or even Crew. I'm just saying this more broadly. The heat gets turned up and they turn away. The heat gets turned up and they dial it back because they're more concerned about being silenced by, again, the big white money. They're more concerned about that than they are standing on behalf of the marginalized and giving voice to the people that don't have power. And that's a condemnation. That is a condemnation. Honestly.
Yeah. And that feels like a place we need to sit for a moment, because I do want to acknowledge that it is difficult to face the possibility of losing funding,
It
especially if
is.
you're like right on the edge of being able to continue making it.
It
What
is.
what uh what do we do?
Yeah.
How do we face that?
Yeah. Okay. And which again, I'm glad you said it, Eric. It's not easy. Um, it creates fear. And just acknowledge who has said that fear makes cowards of us all. That's the natural impulse, is to cower. It would be to pull back, maybe. That's the default. It takes faith, doesn't it? I mean, isn't that a word that needs to kind of be put back on the table? That when it comes to standing for issues of righteousness or justice, it will take faith and a recognition that maybe there will be consequences. There's going to be pain that I have to experience in order to stand for righteousness. It comes with a cost. And again, I don't say that lightly at all, especially after having written this book. Like, I know what that fear feels like, fear of reprisal. But here's the bottom line. Those people are wrong. If what we're saying, if we agree with, like, let's even say my book, Untangling Critical Race Theory, if you believe that what's being said in that is right, not perfect, but it's right and it's just, then when push comes to shove, I would hope that you would stand with me in that book and stand with me in that content and not cower because you're afraid that somebody's going to pull their money. How about if we disciple those donors? How about if we say, and I've had this happen, I've had to have these kinds of conversations with people that have wanted to pull away from me for different reasons. Well, let's talk about it. Like help me understand why you feel the way you're feeling. Okay, you read the book and then let's have a discussion about it. Let's like actually slow down. Like, I don't assume that just because you're rich that you're also educated when it comes to any of this. And so maybe my role could be to help educate you. And if at the end of the day you still feel like you need to take your money somewhere else, God bless you, and we're going to trust God to replace your $5 million with somebody else. And again, that's where the faith comes in. and having sort of a prophetic disconnect from being concerned about how we're going to be fed or where the money's going to come from to keep the lights on. A prophetic disconnect that says we're going to trust God one way or the other. It's Daniel saying, to Nebuchadnezzar, you might kill me, but at the end of the day, I'm going to do what's right, and I'll trust God to work out the results. Right? I mean, that's a major Ed Uszynski paraphrase, but you know what I'm saying. You do have power, and you could ultimately kill me, but either way, I'm not going to bow down to you. And I just think we need to be infused with that kind of courage. I need that. Other ministry leaders need that, because otherwise we just end up kind of gravitating back towards the default that's always been in place, which is everything that we just talked about when it comes to this topic. And that is that we won't talk about it because it offends people. And so you leave Black and brown people in a position where they can't trust us, where they question the gospel, where they have to deal with anger and bitterness and feelings of betrayal. Like, we are complicit in creating that feeling amongst those populations. And I really mean we. I will say we, because I know the reaction is, I don't do that. I don't do that. No, but we as a collectivity, white evangelicalism has been complicit in creating that experience for Black and brown brothers and sisters literally across centuries. So on my watch, and I would hope on your watch and listeners' watch, like, what can we do to have that be different? To have the Black and brown people that are in our sphere of influence, to create a different experience for them, and to make sure that's not happening to them at our church, in our parachurch organization, in our community. That's the question I think that we as Christians need to keep asking.
Yeah. And maybe the last point just on this topic in particular, kind of also transitioning.
Okay.
Does does it work to, whether in your experience or in your thought process or whatever, does it work in terms of trying to educate people who are not in this place to say, no, this is not CRT, this is the Bible? Or, I mean, probably more gently than that, depending on who you're talking to. But does it work to try and go through in terms of education of like, here's what CRT is versus here's what the Bible is, or here is what whatever acronym you're using to sort of decry what we're doing. This is how
Yeah.
it actually ties in. Does that work as a process, or what is the way to try bringing people along in those instances?
Yeah. Well, does it work? It works to the extent that people have ears to hear and hearts that are willing to change. And that's true with any Bible idea, right? Not just about race, but do passages on the scriptures work to help people maintain a sexual ethic that's aligned with God's plan? Well, sometimes yes, and sometimes no. They work to the extent that we're willing to submit to them and humble ourselves and see differently and think differently. So I I want to spend way less time and less energy with people who have made it abundantly clear that they have hard hearts, and they really, with just this race topic itself, like, they have no interest at all in changing. Okay, like, again, it's not my role to go around trying to change everybody. My I feel like my role is to try to bring understanding. If I have any role at all, it's to try to bring understanding, it's to try to bring healing, it's to try to be a missionary and have a missiologically shaped mind that says, I'm going to try to be an ambassador for the gospel to different kinds of people. And within the church, I'm going to try to help those people to see each other through the eyes of Jesus, and not just through their secular and ideological lenses, and try to be the church together. So I don't know why that works with some people and doesn't work with others. I don't know why some people in the church continue to have hard hearts about all kinds of different topics that I think need to be broken. But yeah, that is the solution. What you just described, it's to bring the Bible to bear on people's lives. It's to try to bring perspective to bear. It's to try to bring people's stories, because there seems to be power in people's stories. When you hear people's narrative, it seems to have as good a chance of anything of helping people to change their thinking. And I want to spend more time with people that are saying, I really do want to change. I'm just not sure where to go or how to, I don't trust people when it comes to this race conversation. I feel there's a lot of that too amongst white people, because all they hear is the extremes. They hear the extreme conservative view, they hear the extreme progressive view, and they know that salvation is not really found in either one of those when it comes to this topic. They know that's not the truth. So, like, really, what does it look like to have a racial ethic and a racial literacy that lives somewhere in the middle of that? That's the voice that I've wanted to be in this discussion, and I hope there will continue to be more.
Yeah, so do I.
Yeah.
I think my last question for you here today. So we've brought up, just as terms, CRT, woke, DEI, that have all sort of become we're going to sort of use this as we don't have to talk about this because it's that, whether it is or isn't, whatever we're talking about. And it seems like those terms are here to stay, at least for a while. Do you have a sense of what might be the next thing? Is there a thing that you see on the horizon that, oh, now people are going to point to that thing and say, we don't need to talk about these conversations because it's just that?
Ooh, that's a great question, Eric. Nobody's asked me that question, and I'm not sure that I do actually off the top of my head. I just know that, again, there's this historically, whatever effort there is made to bring about reconciliation, whatever effort there is to bring about equality, it will always be met with what's called retrenchment in academic circles, where you go back and kind of dig your heels in, and you try to kind of turn back the clock, so to speak. And again, we're living in a time right now where politically, because Donald Trump is so brash and not afraid to just say whatever he wants to say. I mean, he is living that out verbally for us, that we're going to wipe out, the all this talk from history books, and we're going to go back and put Confederate names back on things. And like, he literally wants to roll back everything. And again, whatever people think about that, okay? To answer your question, whatever topic comes up to try to bring about equality from progressive politics or from the more liberal-minded politics, that is going to be met with a closed fist and a punch right to its forehead, whatever that is.
Yeah.
But I don't know. No, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it, honestly. And we really are right now kind of in the middle of the DEI blowback. So, and that'll run its course soon enough. What I wish would happen, Eric, and I would just say this, I wish that we as Christians, when times are not as emotional. So when it comes to CRT, for example, like, that's not really trending right now. That's not getting the visceral responses. Those letters aren't floating around on Fox News the way they were 5 years ago. Pops up here and there. I wish people, though, would actually say, you know what, now that things have calmed down, I really do want to understand more what is behind this whole critical race theory thing. If it was from the 80s, what can I learn about that? If guys like Ed, and again, people don't know me, they don't know whether they need to trust me or not. But if I say we were actually using that stuff in the 1990s and it was super helpful in our conversations, in a very conservative, white evangelical organization, we were having great conversations around the questions that were being raised by critical race theorists. I wish people would say, oh, I want to learn more about that. Like, what does that mean? What did that look like? Instead of just completely ignoring it and going back about our business and not paying any attention to it all. I wish that we had been paying more attention to critical race theory in the 1990s. I wish we'd written more books as Christians about what these guys are what are they teaching, and without having to go along with their solutions to the questions or their solutions to the problems, their questions and the problems that they're exposing actually really are begging for a gospel response. So how do we as Christians use critical race theory to actually bring about more gospel responses to the race problem? How do we increase our racial literacy so that we're not so ignorant when it comes to race, instead of just ignoring it or waiting for the next racial quake to happen socially before we're going to pay any attention to it for a period of time, and get knocked around by all the political pundits when it comes to the topic? I wish we would study it more now.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that's part of what it means in my mind to have ears to hear, is to keep mulling on questions like that you then bring into how am I acting in the world based off of what a Christian worldview is and how we move forward to continue living as God's people.
Yeah, good, man. And again, that's why I wrote Untangling Critical Race Theory. I mean, that's because I hope for the people that want to keep talking and they want to keep understanding. Again, you can only, unless you're going to be unless your job is to be in race space all the time, it's not like you can just do that endlessly and indefinitely. But you go through seasons where it's like really worth doing a deep dive into a topic or a subject. And race is one that should keep coming up regularly for us as Christians, because it's never going to go away until Jesus returns, again, because it's a satanic stronghold. Just like needing to talk about sexuality is never going to go away, or needing to talk about what we do with our money is never going to go away. We're going to have to constantly be getting brought back to, like, what is a biblical ethic? And I thought I had this, but then I kind of fell away. So how do I get back right again in my thinking about this? Race is that kind of a topic. It should be for us.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place, I think, to leave people to keep considering how to keep moving forward in this and keep learning and keep addressing things. So
thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me on. I'm glad you're doing this work. And again, just to stimulate people to want to keep asking questions and maybe dig deeper on all the different things that you're having them think about on these podcasts. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.